All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio, burning through year 17 on this show. And we're going to talk about something that we've talked about many times. In fact, I talked about it on this show 17 years ago. But back then, it was really just a conversation. I mean, you couldn't really do data governance in any meaningful way. You could control access to an application or access to a database, for example, but that's about all you could do. And once you get to a larger organization, that's not even tenable. You can't live like that. So over the years, things have changed. Now we have data catalogs, for example, which are very useful. We have data portal type strategies that can be built. But today we're going to get into the weeds with a couple of experts in the field. We'll be talking to Jarrel Jimmerson and also Aaron Wilson. Jarrel has been working in a number of different companies over the years in financial services and also healthcare. And Aaron has a lot of experience in financial services as well and some other industries also. And we'll talk about putting meat on the bones, basically. So when you're doing data governance, if that's your job, is to roll out a data governance program, let's say at a financial services company, what does that look like? What does the plan look like? And then I'm most interested in the tactics, like day to day. What are you actually doing, meeting to meeting, email to email? What does it actually look like to hash out, implement, and then enforce a data governance program? So with that, Jarrel, I'll bring you into the conversation. You've got a lot of experience with this, and I'm so impressed with anyone who pulls this off. Because let's face it, launching a data governance program isn't like a walk in the park. It's not like taking your family to the baseball game. I mean, it's you have to rein and herd cats, I guess I would say. And not just people, but systems. You got to know the systems. You have to understand how they're being used. You have to know what the policies and the regulations are. Then you have to build a program around incrementally moving toward that ideal world where data is well governed, trusted, and does what you want it to do. So, with that, tell our audience a bit about yourself, your experience, and how you do data governance.
Yeah, thank you. So I've spent 7+ years working with a large financial company, Charles Schwab. They, like many companies, had a couple of attempts with data governance and had challenges, and joined the firm as they were starting a new journey again on data governance. And luckily, this journey has stuck and has worked really well. My opportunity with Charles Schwab was to build out a strategy to implement data governance across their operational services group. And that group at Schwab is very centralized because a lot of the core common services that apply to their banks and their broker dealer and other services are all common. So they built a centralized organization for that. So my opportunity was to help them build some data governance practices in their security master platform that they were building, a brand new system of record. Worked with them for a while, also then started working in other parts of trading. So I work with their trading infrastructure group, their market data group, or they bring in the quotes from the different exchanges, and then basically built a strategy to implement data governance across 6 different verticals in operational services. So I had to sell that plan to the executives, help them understand that this is something we need to do, and you will see the benefit from it. It's not just a mandate. And there had been become more of a mandate within Schwab as the federal regulatory agencies have seen and recognized that managing data risk is key to financial firms' viability, protecting customer data, that sort of thing. So I think there's definitely sort of the carrot of the business value that you create with data governance, as well as the defensive mechanism from sort of a protection of the data and making sure that everything's classified and you've got the right quality. Because one of the things that's kind of key is, trust is built over time and lost in an instant. And
Yeah.
that's one of the guiding principles at Schwab. And I truly believe that applies to all businesses or companies. So it was an interesting endeavor. So everything from educating and identifying the right data owners that own the data within the processes, identifying the business data stewards that have the subject matter expertise to deliver, because you can't do this by a centralized team. The firm is too large. So they had a federated data governance model with the centralized data governance office, and then federated entities like operational services. And my team was one of those. So we built a team that had some financial expertise. Others had very much data governance expertise, and some of them had just financial services expertise. So we had a mixed team that kind of played off of each other from an experience standpoint. But the intent was to educate the whole enterprise on what what it means to govern data and how do you do that and what are the practices. So building playbooks, roles, responsibilities, project plans, KPIs, all those sorts of things. So it was quite a journey, I would say.
Yeah. Well, you brought up a bunch of really good points there. And the roles, I think we should dig in a bit to the roles. So, data steward, that always struck me as one of the most important roles in a data governance program, because here's someone who has to know the business and they have to know the data and they also have to know the technology and be able to align those things together and then explain to the business. And you want to be business friendly because the I think perception that is now starting to fade a bit is that, oh, data governance is just going to slow us down. It's going to restrict access. I don't want that. I want to do things my way. That tendency that business people often have, right? Especially entrepreneurs. I want to just get stuff done. What do you mean I have to do X, Y, and Z? It's like, well, there are regulations and in fintech, obviously, you've got regulations to deal with. But talk maybe a bit about a couple of those different roles, like the data steward. Was that the one of the harder ones to find people who were good at that?
Uh, I would say it wasn't that difficult, and mainly because we worked through sort of a leadership structure to identify who owned the data, who was responsible for the key processes that would have likely critical data. And then those data owners knew within their organization who are those subject matter experts that could either fill that role as a business data steward or support my team if we became their data steward on their behalf, provide that expertise within the business. So we use that leadership and knowledge of their business and who are the kind of some of the key players. And for the most part, we got it right. There were times where we changed out business data stewards, but for the most part, it worked really well. And then on the technology side, we had a technical data steward role within the IT organization, and they were clearly those folks that own the platforms and were very involved with the agile and scrum teams that Schwab had moved to and would provide that technical expertise that would be needed as well, because you need that technical and business knowledge together to make it all work.
Mm-hmm. And then obviously you have to map out the information architecture. Where is data coming from? Where is it going? The whole lineage side of the equation. Is that something that you got tools to do, or like how do you even begin to map out a data flow for a financial services company?
Yeah, honestly, that's one of the most challenging aspects because you can imagine a company the size of Charles Schwab. There's tons of legacy apps, there's mainframes, there's other lots of technologies involved, and it's not all one technology stack. So lineage is one of the most challenging things, and you look for the tools in the market that have the best types of connectors and capabilities that would enable the business to use them and technology folks. But ultimately, there's no perfect tool in the market. So it is a challenging process. And I would say that data lineage sort of holy grail is still probably in play today. It's just one of those things where you have to kind of prioritize, work on the most critical things first, and know that it's going to take quite a bit of time because some of it's manual, some of it's automated. It all depends upon the tech stack that's involved. And then
Right.
also, the folks' knowledge, because again, you have some of these systems that are 30 plus years old. You lose that tenure and the understanding of the system in some cases. So that makes it even more challenging.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And you wind up, I'm guessing, having a lot of exploratory meetings with folks, right? Like when you come in, you have to identify who are the business leaders, who are the technical leaders, and then you just have to set up meetings with them to watch. So what do you do? How do you do it? What tools do you use? Did you develop a sort of matrix of some kind so that you had a visual representation of the world that you're dealing with, or how did that work?
Yeah, we did. We actually worked on the trade confirmation process as TD Ameritrade was being integrated into Schwab. There was an interest of whether or not the trade confirmation process at Schwab was as solid and as tight as it needed to be. And yeah, so we did end up mapping that out. We started with some basic tools like Microsoft Visio, right? Easy enough to draw some visuals. But over time we used some enterprise tools as well, using like IBM BlueWorks Live to map some of those things and then tie up and locate and identify the controls and map those into their GRC process as well. So I think that was a really smart endeavor from the folks at Schwab to look at how do you tie business continuity, your governance, risk, and control framework to your data, and getting all that put together in a way that works. And then using Calibra was the ultimate metadata tool that was selected to use. That's where the primary metadata source was, and that's also where those processes and mappings were going to be put as well.
Yeah, that's good information. And Aaron, I'll bring you back in after one more question to Jarrel here. I spent years in the risk management space. I moderated all the webinars for a group called GARP. I love that name. The World According to GARP. It's the Global Association of Risk Professionals, and or as I call them, the de facto Illuminati. They're the ones that control risk appetite for central banks all around the world. I mean, it's pretty serious stuff. And what really stuck in my mind throughout those days was, of course, concepts like risk appetite and risk exposure and things of this nature, but control points. And you talked about that a couple of times. And control points are really important because they are points at which some action can be taken, either an approval or a disapproval, either routing something in a certain direction or raising a red flag or something like that. But those control points really are like the skeletal components of a governance program, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say moving from manual controls to automated controls is certainly a focus, right? Because of the scale. It's tough to handle manual controls. So that was definitely a focus and needs to be a focus when you're doing it at enterprise scale, automating controls and looking for, things like consistency and completeness, accuracy and timeliness. You want all that to be as automated as possible given the scale of a firm of that size.
Right. Yeah, Aaron, I'll throw it over to you. I mean, I'm sure a lot of that was resonating with you from the projects that you've been on. And it's, my father-in-law has a great expression he uses. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? I mean, you have to have a plan and then you got to start chipping away. And I'm sure it always starts with understanding the stakeholders, who are the people we need to be working with, we need at the table, and then figuring out how are we going to sell this concept? How are we going to get buy-in? Because unless people talk to you and tell you what they're really doing, it gets pretty hard to get these things done, right, Aaron?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at Athena, we have a data governance, framework, which we have six components, but the first one is always people. We have people with processes, data architecture, metadata management, data quality, and security and compliance. But people is the reason why it's so important is because the model for so long with many industries has been, the data has been the domain and kind of on the tech side. And, the people who are downstream of the data have very little involvement and control, which is not a good model because the people who are actually using the data and communicating that data to customers, have really a low level of control, a low level of involvement. So bringing, the idea of data stewards on the non-technical side, on the business side, and getting them involved is probably the biggest component, I feel, of a data governance effort. If you get them involved and you kind of establish a culture where people understand that we're all data experts. We're not just button pushers out there, and we have you know we have some involvement, even things. I would take a little example, which is, if a company's bringing on a new data set, for example, that we're going to be reporting on, make sure that people on the business side are involved in that process and involved in that discussion, and they understand it. You want to encourage understanding and involvement from people on the business side. Otherwise, a data governance effort really is unlikely to be successful.
Yeah, and you want to have the vision of where you want things to go. And I mean, that's I think a fairly simple vision, which is we want to understand the data that we're using, how it's being used, and that it is of a high quality. Because, like Jarrell said, trust takes years to build and moments to lose. And so you want to be careful as you go down that road. But the bottom line is you want to have good, high quality data. And then once you've established that, you can start bringing in new data sources and getting more creative. But that is the absolute foundation, it seems to me, is that you want to make sure the data you're using is accurate and timely. Would that be about right, Aaron?
I definitely think so. the idea is that I mean, we have so many trends that are kind of pushing firms to get better at this, right? Um, the volume of data, the quantity of data that firms are encountering and have to deal with on a daily basis. You mentioned before the data privacy regulations and concerns around that. That's a really big one. This idea that you were talking about before, where you say years back, you would have discussions around data governance, and it would seem kind of like a little bit of a nuisance, maybe a little bit of a distraction. Um, we're kind of entering a world now where companies can't really afford to view it that way, because the risks are too high. Bad data is now such a liability that, and the only way you really are going to get a handle on it, in other words, govern it, is by involving people throughout the business.
Yeah. No, that makes complete sense. And then once you've, and I think most people understand that. I think sometimes you do have to show business people or even some technical people, you have to show them the data so they can see the problems. It doesn't take long. Just grab any segment of any database that you've got in your company and take a look at it in a spreadsheet. You're going to see missing values. You're going to see bad values. You're going to see values in the wrong fields and things of this nature. And it shows up everywhere. I mean, it can be a bit daunting, in fact, when you do that, because it's like, oh my God, how are we going to deal with this? And I'm one of these people. My tendency is, okay, I'm going to start fixing these individual pieces of data. Like, all right, you can spend the rest of your life doing that. So you do have to have a certain tolerance for things to be able to go down that road. But once you've got people at the table, that is a question of building out the plan. Where do we want to go? What's realistic? I think that's probably one of the harder challenges to work through, is to just understand and be able to explain what is a realistic estimate of what we can accomplish in a particular period of time. You do certainly have to know what tools are in place, how mature are these tools, who's using these tools. I mean, and some of that basic stuff for the older tools, it's not that easy to access. I mean, now we have all kinds of interesting technologies like observability, showing us when data feeds stop coming through, when something changes, when there's a change in schema somewhere, someone added a
Right?
field.
Data
We've
monitoring,
gotten very
basically. Yeah.
data monitor. We've gotten
Right.
very sophisticated about that, and that's great stuff if you have those tools. But folks, don't touch that dial. We'll be right back with this conversation about data governance. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, talking all things data governance with Jarrel Jimmerson, an experienced professional in the field, and Aaron Wilson of Athena Solutions, also very experienced. And you both have had experience in the financial services realm, where it's obviously very important to get definitions right. Reporting needs to be deterministic. You need to know exactly how many dollars went from here to there and what the margins are and all this kind of fun stuff. And Aaron, I'll throw it over to you maybe first, because you talked about, I think before the show, building a data dictionary for an asset management company. Can you walk us through what that looks like? How do you define the different terms you're going to approach, and how do you actually get those definitions hashed out?
Yeah, well, it is a daunting effort. And as you mentioned, most of my experience has been on the investment industry side, and there's a lot of complexity to that data. There's a ton of different external data sources that you're bringing in, market data. There's also data that you've got in your accounting system. You've got all sorts of different measures of, let's say, investment returns, performance, characteristics. People really, and the demand, is insatiable on the part of clients to see, like, breaking up their portfolio different ways and looking at things from different, from statistically from different perspectives. And yeah, really, what seems to work, as daunting as it is really going to the reporting. And a firm might have reporting that goes out via the web, with their website. They might have reports that go out in the form of quarterly reports and so forth. And they might have marketing materials where they're bringing in people, to sell the customer on various products and strategies. Trying to corral all of that reporting data together is kind of where you start, at least in my experience. And then, yes, from there you have the effort of defining that data, trying to get some, usually put together some semblance of lineage, getting people from different business units across the company to agree on what the data definitions are. That's kind of the starting point for a lot of data governance efforts. It's difficult. There are luckily though tools on the marketplace that are making it easier these days, especially data catalog and data lineage tools. But yeah, that's kind of the long and the short of it, and it does require participation from the company on and people in the company at various levels.
Yeah, and you really like, let's dive into the data catalog. It seems to me you want this to be more than just a wiki. You want it to be more than something someone can go to if they're curious about what a definition is. You want it actually piped into your reporting solutions, right? In other words, you've got maybe a data warehouse or some operational systems, then your data catalog is pulling from those, and then your reporting system leans on the data catalog to understand what the dimensions are to build its reports. Isn't that right? You want that to be connected and fluid from operational data through the marshaling area, which is usually a data warehouse, for example, and then out to the reporting through the lens of the catalog. Is that right?
Basically, yes. I mean, I think the big innovation that has made data catalog such a big topic, and something that's really being viewed as a key component now to governance efforts, is the fact that we now have harvesting capabilities. And for those who have seen a couple of the previous webinars that I've done with you, Eric, you probably understand that. But to give a real sort of general definition of what's going on there, we now have tools where we can actually go to the data assets themselves. We have tools that can essentially interrogate. Some people like to use the word crawl, but anyway, pull the metadata information out of the actual, let's say, ETL jobs, for example, or let's say out of the reporting tools, and being able to do it that way, it ensures more accuracy, and you have a lot better chance of being current, because that's a repeatable process.
Right.
There's a really key missing component of it. But as to your point, yes, you want it to be integrated as much as possible with what's actually going on with the data in your organization.
Yeah, like when someone goes to build a report, I'll throw it over to you, Jarrel. When someone wants to build a new report, I want to understand how our marketing efforts are affecting our top line revenue in this particular space. You go and you grab certain dimensions. Maybe you're working in Tableau or Spotfire or one of these different tools. And I think ideally you want many of the key definitions to be brought out of the data catalog, because that's where you put your effort to define things and you connect that. And to Aaron's point, this harvesting is a huge game changer. And I remember when that first started coming out, I want to say it was Alation or one of these other tools that would just go out and scan your information systems and come back and give you reports on which databases you have. And you try to align the fields, the header records, basically with these different systems. And that, of course, is master data management, right? You're reconciling virtually all these different information systems. But point being, you want that to all be as connected as possible, because as soon as you go offline and start doing something in your own spreadsheet, then data governance goes out the window, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think lineage is, one of the more challenging aspects of data governance even today. There are tools that will crawl, like you mentioned, sources, but a lot of these firms have a lot of legacy systems that have challenges with that. So sometimes you have to have manual intervention to capture those missing links that the tool that you're choosing doesn't have that particular connector. So that's been my experiences. You automate as much as possible, and then you have to supplement with manual efforts. And ultimately, you're right; those outputs are key to regulators or marketing folks to make sure that data is trusted. But you want to know where it came from. And in
Right.
my mind, it's one thing to govern the data at source, but you also want to make sure that it's good at point of consumption as well.
Mm-hmm. And that is probably a lot of manual checking that goes on, right? I mean, in the DevOps world, we have all these automated testings that people are doing now. Are you starting to see that in data governance where you set up, because one thing I'm sure you want is scores on things, right? I've heard a lot of talk around bronze, silver, and gold, for example. And a gold system, a standard is when, okay, this is deterministic. We have very, very high confidence that these numbers are correct. Whereas a bronze is maybe more for an analytic sandbox or something like that. Is that a mechanism you would use in some of your past lives, Jarrel?
Yes, definitely. We use sort of that green, amber, red model, same kind of deal. Basically, for our data quality rules to kind of know on an ongoing basis, and then we had automated alerting to let the stewards know and the owners know there's an issue, and then there's an issue remediation process. So I think those types of things and having that running on the right frequency so that you're on top of changes that occur to the data are critical to ensuring that you brought something under governed and it's well governed and it stays that way, right? That if something changes that surprises you because of a release, because maybe that DevOps process didn't catch something that went into production or had an unintended consequence. So I think that's really important, is to have that ongoing view of your data, as well as making sure that it was delivered with good quality at implementation stage.
Yeah, and there are all sorts of alerts. Like how much of your job in the past has been reactive as opposed to proactive? And I'm guessing ideally you want to be mostly proactive and like 80/20 or something like that. But is that realistic? Does that make sense? Like how often are you like, oh geez, something happened, we got to go put out a fire versus strategically moving forward to get things done?
Well, it's a good question. I think the red, I mentioned the red, amber, and green. Amber says, hey, you should take a look at this, but it's not a burning fire. Red
Right.
says, hey, it's exceeded the threshold, so you need to take action. And at Schwab, we had different thresholds for responding to red versus amber. So you had a certain amount of time, and then there's a centralized data governance team that's saying, hey, this alert has generated this ticket within Calibra, and you need to take action on this and remediation, and at least acknowledge it. First of all, acknowledge you have the problem, you know that there's a problem, and then start to put notes and track the case or the ticket that was created to completion. So it all depends on the severity of what's happening as to how fast you move on some of those things. And then there are times where maybe you identify your thresholds weren't initially correct, right? Maybe you
Right.
didn't quite understand the data when you wrote the rules to begin with. So we saw a lot of adjustments to the rules after we originally created them, and that's natural, I think. You're kind of dialing your process and your thresholds for pain, so to speak, right?
Yeah, I'll throw that over to Aaron. That sounds like it makes a lot of sense. So you've got your idea of how the rules should work. We're going to set it up at the 95% quality or something, and you realize this is just unattainable. I mean, I've heard this from a number of people, even in the AI world, of coming up with a model, and he says basically that 50% there is easy, but getting to 80% is a little bit harder, and anything past 80% is like, the law of diminishing returns kind of stares you in the face every day. So how do you manage that sort of thing, Aaron, of recognizing that your rules may have been too strict or not strict enough, and managing that change process over time? How big a deal is that?
I could say in the investment industry, that's something that I've run into many times. What you what helps a lot is, like you said, an iterative process where you hopefully don't go live with a control that's set too wide or too small until you've done some pretty thorough testing. And you want to have expertise on your side, hopefully somebody from the business unit that really understands the nuances, right? Because just as a real easy example that I've run into more than once is, you might have an investment firm, but the behavior of you and the returns on a fixed income product are going to they behave differently than an equity product. Equity returns are generally more volatile. So you really do have to design two separate sets of controls with two separate thresholds in order for to stop, in order to catch false positives and things like that, to be able to get those out of the way and have a useful control. It all boils down to really knowledge of the product itself, and how they work. And it's yet another reason why getting people involved from the business, just doing it strictly from a data standpoint, you're going to miss a lot of things. So you need that institutional knowledge, and you need people who really know how all the nuances.
Right. Well, Gerald, I'll throw this one over to you too. And organizations have structures. You have hierarchies, you have divisions. We all know that silos are a problem in the data world, just getting access to that data and being able to do something with it. I think that the Gen AI movement is going to address that. Now, how quickly is another question, depending upon the organization. But the bottom line is that right now, you have IT people, and they're the ones running the systems typically. You have data people, and they're the ones who understand the data, and they maybe work with the IT people. And then you have business people, and these tend to be three discrete camps that really need to be talking to each other all the time because the IT affects the access to the data, which affects how the business operates, and like they all affect each other. So do you find that it's really imperative that you get people from each of those domains involved intricately, like on a daily or maybe at least a weekly basis to keep this thing rolling, to keep it moving? Is that your experience?
Absolutely. It's key to have all those three different roles you mentioned involved. And that's why at Schwab we had business data stewards that were separate from the technical data stewards. The business data stewards would maybe perhaps be a product owner within the business side. So they understood the business well, they worked well with the technical team and the Scrum teams. But your data owners almost always and should, in my opinion, live on the business side because they are the ones who are accountable and get called to the carpet by a regulator or an auditor. So you do have to have that involvement with all three groups. And ultimately, it works well if you keep that line of communication open. And I think that kind of goes back to what he was saying earlier is you have to have that active stewardship model to have that success. You can't set it all up and assume it's just going to work. You have to continue to feed it and care for it and make sure that folks are involved and engaged. Because if you lose the engagement, it's really hard to recover and it's hard to
Yeah.
get people back to the table.
Wow. That's a great line. I think I'm gonna write that down as a quote. Aaron, I'll throw it over to you. We got about a minute and a half in this segment. When you lose engagement, it's typically gone. I mean, they go on, they do something else, they're not coming back. And that's, it reminds me, I've got a good friend in the healthcare industry, and she would tell me that she would go from office to office for one of the big healthcare companies. And she said, I always have to call these people every week and just talk to them because that's when you get leading indicators of problems. If you don't do that, then you're only going to get a lagging indicator, and then it's too late. Real quick, 45 seconds, Aaron.
Sure. I mean, it goes to, like I said before, you know, the Athena model, people is, it's the first piece of the puzzle, right? And you have to, what I have seen with data governance efforts that don't do so well is, yeah, exactly, lack of engagement. That's usually the problem. Training and awareness and getting people to feel like they really have a stake in the data and that they really are data owners is probably it's one of the most important things for sure in a successful data governance effort.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Well, folks, don't touch that dial. I'll be right back talking to Jarrel Jimmerson and Aaron Wilson all about the nuts and bolts of data governance, how to build your plan, how to execute on that plan, how to stay on top of it so people stay happy. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, talking all things data governance. Doesn't everyone want to talk about data governance? I'm impressed at how much people do want to talk about data governance these days. I think the lots of people finally got the memo. I don't know if it was the data breach or it was, privacy situation or AI awareness or what it was, but I can tell you this, folks, before you start training your AI model on all of your enterprise data, you're going to want to take a good hard look at that data. You should make sure that it's in order, that you have accurate information, because these models, I joke that training a model is kind of like raising a kid. You have to be careful about the information that you expose to them, because if you say a curse word in front of your kid when she's 2 years old, she's going to say it back. And you're going to be like, oh no, and you can't untrain that model. I promise you, you can try all you want, but it's in there now. It's in there. So you got to be careful about that stuff. But Gerald, I'll throw it over to you because you've worked in financial services and healthcare, both heavily regulated industries, and there are a lot of unique aspects of each of these verticals, but there's a lot of similarities too. What have you seen that's similar from healthcare to financial services?
I would say the similarities, definitely similarities and differences. From a similarities perspective, I would say healthcare wise, I spent 15 plus years working with healthcare from an analytics standpoint, ETL, business intelligence, working then with data strategy and data management as a chief data officer. All that showed me was everyone struggles with the volume of data they have and the legacy of old systems and old caches of data. One of the challenges I saw at Texas Health and Human Services was they how are segmented and siloed in their own programs because the programs are either state funded, federally funded, or some blend thereof, sometimes even local. And it's really hard for them to share data even with themselves within the agency because they're all organized around their funding source, right? And that's kind of makes it a challenge. And folks are like, okay, this is my program, this is my data. And as chief data officer, I'm trying to open people's eyes and go, okay, let's understand all the different healthcare events that are happening with the client, regardless of the program. So building a data asset inventory was one of the things we focused on is where is the data across all these hundreds of systems that live across these different agencies? And then how can we relate those data together through master data management so that we can say, hey, this client is receiving all these different services. Perhaps that gives you a better picture of the overall health of that client. And then and counterpart is the provider as well, who's providing those services and where is the expenditure going and which companies are benefiting the clients. It just gives you that kind of bird's eye view that was lacking, and it was a real challenge in the public sector side with healthcare.
That's not surprising, but it helps when you describe it because to your point, you're serving one master typically. And so as an employee, well, my funding comes from here, so that's where I'm going to focus. Well, my funding comes from there, so that's where I'm going to focus. And I think you did something very clever, which is to reorient the thinking around the subject matter, around the client or the customer or the patient, for example. And let's work from that direction to kind of understand how we can collaborate on these things. And it's my experience that most people do want to collaborate so long as their fear of whatever it is can be managed, right? Whether it's too much oversight, someone not understanding what I'm doing, someone stealing my thunder, taking credit for what I've done, all these things. And those are cultural realities, right? So that's where senior leadership comes into play, like a chief data officer, and brings people together. Like, I'll give you a fun example because we're in the risk world. What was it? I was talking to at a GARP event, in fact, at a risk management event, and I was asking about this whole territorial side of things and how do you deal with that from a decision making perspective? And this guy gave a really interesting answer. He said, no, he goes, I know exactly what you're talking about. And what we did is we came up with a process where we wouldn't vote yes or no. We would concur or not concur with a finding or a suggestion, for example. And I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. It's like you're not saying no, but we don't really concur with that right now. It kind of means it doesn't align right now. Not that it won't. I thought that was a very clever way of managing the psychology of process. What do you think, Jarrel?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. It's a very innovative way to look at it as opposed to, just a black and white yes or no sort of answer. One of the things that I saw working at the agencies was the creation of data sharing agreements and getting that kind of common contract of, okay, if you're going to use my data, here are the restrictions because the consumer may not know all the obligations that the producer has in their program. So understanding what's allowed and what's not allowed with that data, what can maybe be released, what has to be aggregated, what has to be de-identified. So I think that's kind of key as well. And that's one of the things, even at Charles Schwab, I'll compare the healthcare to financial services. When you have a big system like the enterprise security master that's sharing reference data that's used all over the firm, you want to have that sort of handshake and understanding of how the data is being used so that people don't misinterpret it, right? You want to have that common understanding, but you also need to have that, again, it goes back to lineage and understanding who's using the data, and then the producer and the consumer both have obligations in that scenario.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Aaron, I'll throw that over to you. I think it always pays to bring in a different perspective. And I really liked what Jarrel was saying about retraining focus on the customer. What else? I heard someone say this the other day. I thought it was very interesting. She's a marketer and a brand manager person, and she said, I always remind people focus on the brand, right? So it because that's who we all work for, XYZ Corp. So what's best for XYZ Corp? If that's your North Star in your head, it tends to solve a lot of these sort of mini disputes about process or data ownership or whatever. If you get people thinking on a regular basis, what is good for the brand, and then build your argument around that. It's kind of hard to argue against that when it's pretty clearly in favor of the brand to move in this direction. What do you think, Aaron?
Definitely. The idea that I have seen is that in the investment industry, again, going back to my experience, the biggest risk is that you report out a bad number for, let's say, a person's portfolio return. How much money did they earn in their portfolio for a particular quarter? And there's a whole practice around calculating those numbers, investment returns. Um, you know, but in the reporting field, you have whole reporting teams, marketing teams that are utilizing this data. They're actually communicating that data out to the customer. They have sales teams that are pitching the product and using those exact numbers as well. Um, and it literally is one bad number in a presentation can, ruin your client engagement. So I think the investment industry is pretty keyed in and has been for a long time on the idea of how important it is to have controls around data. And the complexity of it is really the daunting thing. But having engagement from people who want, oftentimes the people in IT, um, you know, as great as they might be at coding, as great as they might be at ETL and getting the data into the reporting systems, they don't necessarily have the understanding of what you know how critical that is when a client is sitting and looking at that investment return. So yeah, again, bringing in different perspectives and bringing perspectives from the business, very important.
Yeah, that's it's important to stay on top of things and to always have the door open, right? I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but you always want to have the door open. And I guess that a lot of times just boils down to regular meetings. Like my friend was telling me, she has to call these individual offices at least once a week and just chit chat and see what's going on. Because there are squeaky wheels, and then there are a lot of people who are a bit more passive aggressive, right? And so for those people, you have to like just spend a little more time talking to them, understanding what they're doing, and that's a management process, right, Jarrel?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that regular cadence is key to success for data governance and data management in general, and making sure you're staying on the radar with them and that they aren't sort of forgetting about the other fires that are going on and just forgetting about the importance of data management, because things may be going well for a while and therefore you wouldn't necessarily have to check in with them, but it's great to share the positive, right? And here, look, we haven't had any data quality breaches in 3 months on this particular area. So I think, to me, it's good to share the good news as well as have to knock on the door when things aren't going so well.
And that's actually a really good point, is give credit where credit is due. Make sure you give credit to every team member. I'm not saying you have to have a board on the wall where you check it up. Okay, I complimented Bill today and I complimented Susan and I complimented Fred or whatever. But just know that it works better when you encourage good behavior as opposed to discouraging bad behavior. And I've seen both management styles. I don't do well in a knuckle rapping, wrist slapping environment. That's not my style. And so I'm in a business line where I don't have to deal with that. I don't have people rapping me on the knuckles to get this done or that done. And but you have to know your own culture. But I do know this for sure. Everybody likes to be complimented. Everybody likes to be thanked. Everybody likes to be encouraged. It doesn't matter across all industries and all walks of life. Everybody likes that. Well, podcast bonus segment is coming up next, folks. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, talking all things data governance with Jarrel Jimmerson and Aaron Wilson. And I will tell you a story from my past. The best manager I ever had, a guy, Peter Quinn, he was so good that I didn't even know what good management was until I worked for this guy. And it really blew my mind. I went up there, I moved up to Seattle to work with him. And I'm in his office the very first time. We're doing our Monday morning meeting at like 10 a.m. So it's just right off the bat. And we go through this very nice conversation. And at the end, he goes, So what can I do for you? And I remember like looking over my shoulder, like, did some VP just walk in the room? Like, who's he? Oh, he's talking to me? Like, you're gonna what? What is that all about? I had no idea there were people like this. I'm like, wow. But he had the coolest mechanism, and I'll explain what it is. I want to get Aaron and Gerald to comment on this. He was a very, very clever guy. So let's see, got an hour-long meeting. First 5 minutes is always chit chat. How's it going? How's the wife, kids, et cetera, that kind of stuff. And then what he would do is he would have an objective. There was something or two things he wanted to talk about, but he wouldn't just come out and say, "Hey, I want to talk to you about so and so and what happened on this case or whatever." What he would do is he would speak in general terms, and then he would incrementally move like in concentric circles closer and closer to where he wanted to go because he wanted you to figure out what it was that he wanted to talk about. And so he would just kind of just slowly inch towards the center. And then you'd be like, well, actually, there was this one dispute I had with so and so about who's supposed to do this and whatever. And it took me a while to figure out that's what he was doing. But I was like, wow, that's very clever because he's not just browbeating you out of the gate here. He's just talking to you about what's happening and letting you figure out what happened and what he wanted to talk about. Aaron, I'll throw it over to you first. I thought that was absolutely ingenious. I try to do it myself, but I'm nowhere near as good as he was. But what do you think about that?
You're talking about kind of an exercise in psychology. But what little I know about that particular field, people feel more comfortable when they're asked. People feel more comfortable when they're invited. People don't react well oftentimes when somebody just comes along with a command or a declarative statement. If you make it a conversation, then it's you've got two people talking, right? So I think that's what you're talking about there. And a lot of what we're talking about in governance really relies on curiosity and engagement. So there's definitely a tie in there for sure.
Yeah, I'll throw it over to Jarrell. What do you think about that as a management style of getting to the bottom of things, right? Because I tend to be like, all right, now what's going on with this or what's going on with that? And he was much more clever about that, about having a conversation and just slowly inching towards the truth. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, it sounds like a great approach, and I think it's one I would like to use myself a little bit more actively. I found that those leaders that listen more than they talk tend to be the better ones, right?
Mm.
Like that servant leadership. Where can I help you type of mentality. If you're more straight directive, then it becomes more of a challenge, and sometimes it throws up defensive walls with folks. So I think listening and hearing and leading people to the conclusion is really important.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll get some closing thoughts from each of you on how all this aligns to data governance. And I guess your basic um, two or three key considerations. Aaron, I'll throw it over to you. You know, when you first start talking to someone about data governance and trying to encourage them to move forward, what are some of the tactics that you use? How do you get people to talk about this stuff?
Well, as I said before, I keep coming back to this like a broken record, but I mean, it does start with people. So engagement is extremely important. How you create that, I think having team members, assigning roles to people where they're actually regarded as experts, really, in effect, making everyone an expert. When, like I said, this idea of when a data process change
Oh
comes
yeah,
along,
I like
um,
that. Make everyone an expert. That's clever. That's good.
right, right. And you do that by, sort of letting them into the process, I think. Data changes don't just happen from on high. We have everybody brought in to, okay, we're going to bring on, like I said, the example of a new data set. Okay, well, what does that mean? Explain, does everybody understand this data that we're going to be reporting out to, for the first time, that kind of thing. Does anybody see any issues, any problems with the data? So having those kind of conversations get people engaged. I think that the other key piece is metadata management. If it's difficult, and I will say this is where the tools come in and where the improvement in metadata management tools like data catalog. I'm a huge fan of that because it's difficult to get people involved when the tools that they're using are kind of difficult to use and there's not a whole lot of transparency and they have to go through some arduous process. And that part of it is, I think, improving these days. So I think it's those two key components. It's people, but it's also these metadata management tools that are it's a hopefully what I think we're getting into now is sort of a virtuous circle between those two things.
Yeah, that's a good point. We got about a minute and a half left. I'll throw it over to Jarrel. The technology part is a big deal, right? If you have a big enough team, I think you should have at least one person just constantly evaluating different technologies because there's so much stuff coming out. What do you think about that, Jarrel?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think the technology is sort of the enabler, but it's ultimately the people. So I love that Aaron started there, right? Because it's about getting that engagement and keeping that engagement and building the trust. And one of the things that I found that was very successful is understanding where people's pain points are. You may have your own agenda and your own mandate to meet certain standards, but if you can help them create business value for them, they're way more likely to help you and come back to you for more. And that's one of the things that I've seen has been really successful is continuing to, hey, what's working for you? Where are you seeing challenges? What do you have coming up? Keeping that engagement and understanding what problems can you solve for them, because people, what's in it for me? They understand if you're going to do something for them and it's not just a mandate, they're more than likely to stay engaged and keep coming back for more.
That's it. That's what you want. You want people to come to you. You want people to have, I heard this term like with the psychological security. I heard this a few years ago, and it's a very clever concept because if you have an overbearing boss, for example, an overbearing culture, that's when people keep stuff to themselves. That's when they don't want to tell you that there's a problem. Whereas if you're much more open about it and collaborative on these issues, people will come and tell you the problems. And that's when you're going to learn things because you'll never see everything all yourself. They'll never, ever, ever happen. So you need to be talking to people. And now with all these new tools and technologies, you can have a more productive conversation because you can point to the data and say, well, we noticed this happened. Do you have any idea? Was there a new source system that we brought in? Did something, oh, actually, you know what? Jim told me that they were going to, load the new version of this technology. Maybe that's what happened. Oh, yeah. Always fear the upgrade, folks. Fear the upgrade. I'm sort of kidding about that, but look these gentlemen up online. Aaron Wilson, Athena Solutions, and Jarrel Jimmerson, established professional in the data governance field. We'll talk to you next time, folks. You've been listening to DM Radio.